Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Written Page Podcast, which today will be a videocast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I am coming to you from the city of Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And the guest on the show today is an author who was born in London but currently lives with her family in the city of Deerfield, Massachusetts. And there she writes books such as The Power of Poppy Pendle, The Courage of Cat Campbell, The Marvelous Magic of Miss Mabel, and The Daring of Della Dupree, among many others. She joins us for this conversation via Zoom, and her name is Natasha Lowe. And to kick off the conversation, I asked Natasha to go back to her childhood and to think about some memories that she might want to share related to books and her love of writing.
How much time do we have? I was that child that had the vivid imagination. I can't tell you how many hours I spent going around the house hunting for signs of magic. I grew up in a house that was full of books. I had parents that loved to tell stories, and they would during the school year they'd read to us from books in the evenings. Always before bed would get a bedtime story, but in the sometimes at weekends and during vacations, they would make up their own stories. And I think this is where my love of storytelling really began. On long car journeys, my mom would tell stories, and we would spend lots of time in Scotland visiting one of my grandmothers, and Lancashire visiting my other grandmother. And both those places were incredibly magical places to me. They still are, actually. If there are such things as witches, fairies, they're all there. And my dad would tell us stories in the mornings. Would go in and climb into bed, and I have a younger brother and an older sister, and he would make up stories, and they would go from morning to morning, so you wouldn't know what was going to happen next. And they were marvelous things. And so my world, my childhood was just full of stories and books and magic. And um, I would create my own spells in the kitchen. I would get all the little bottles out of my mum's drawer and mix them all together, all those spices and herbs and things that I thought she never used, and try and make my own magic potions. And I've never forgotten that excitement, that possibility of maybe this time, if I rub this spell on this old broom and say the right words in the right way, I'll fly. And of course I never did, but I never forgot the possibility, the wonder of, oh, how would it feel if I did? And that stayed with me. So those years were really formative years for me. And I wasn't the best reader at school. I was, I think, a little slow learning to read, slightly dyslexic. And so when I did learn to read, you couldn't get a book out of my hands. I would reread the same books over and over again. We didn't have the wide variety of choice that kids have nowadays. We did in the library, and we would go to the library, but I had my own little bookcase of books, and I loved those books. And we would read, I mean, some of my favorites, well, my all-time favorite book, the book that I think made me want to be an author, was one that I don't know if you've heard of it. The Little White Horse by Elizabeth Googe is my very favorite book. And this was my mum's favorite book when she was little, and she gave it to my sister and myself. And I remember vividly reading this book in class and reading it under the table because it was a math class. And there were so many vivid descriptions of this magical place and these wonderful descriptions of food. There was a little cook, Marmaduke Scarlet, I think was his name, who would cook these wonderful meals for Maria, this little girl who'd gone to live with her uncle. And I just remember those meals, the thick clotted cream and the bread and the honey and this world of magic and food. And when I'd finished it, thinking, that is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to write books like that. So it's just always been a passion of mine. And I was, and still am, a terrible speller, but I loved writing my own stories. And the first story I ever wrote that I remember was when I was in probably second grade, and it was about a whole jelly world with a jelly planet and jelly animals, and I was really proud of this story. And I remember our teacher, who was also the headmistress, calling me up, and she was a trenchbull. If you've read Matilda, you'll know what I mean. Except she was a thin, mean trenchbull. And she called me up to the front of the class and she held my story up. And I thought I'd done something wrong because her face was red and she was really angry. And she said, "Did you write this?" And I said, "I did." And she said, basically, I can't understand a word of it because every word was misspelled. And she said, "Makes no sense to me." And I don't know if she said these words, I'm sure she didn't, but she made me feel like, "You will never be a writer." And I just remember going home in tears saying, "Well, Miss Ward didn't like my story and I can't write." And my mum basically saying, "Don't listen to her, don't worry about it, keep doing what you're doing, you have great stories to tell." And I did. So I always remember writing stories on the backs of my notebooks, on scraps of paper. And in fact, I was terrible at math and I would write my friend's stories for homework and she would do my math for me. So it was a good trade. So books and stories and magic were a big part of my world growing up.
Now, you mentioned your trips to Scotland, and I wonder, how much in those early years, how much influence those times when you would shuffle off to the Highlands with your family for part of the summer, how much of an influence did Scotland and that landscape and those myths and that atmosphere in Scotland had on the books that you write now?
A lot. And in fact, a story that I'm working on at the moment with my agent is set in Scotland, and it's set in, well, it's set in an old castle, but the castle is sort of based on the old house that my grandmother lived in, which was this big rambling Victorian shooting lodge. And it was her country home, and we would go there for the summers. But the Poppy Pendle books are actually rooted in Lancashire, where my other grandmother lived. So both those places were, like I said, really magical places, but the Poppy books are definitely rooted in Lancashire. My grandmother lived in an area of Lancashire, which is actually the area known as Pendle. There's Pendle Hill, the Pendle Valley, and there were, I don't know if you've heard of the Pendle Witches, which were basically a group of women like your Salem witches that were accused of witchcraft, taken to, I believe, Lancaster Castle and burnt. And so there was this witch lore around the valley, and the house my grandmother lived in, Blacko, was a very old sort of farmhouse, and it was in the middle of this landscape that was just full of witch lore. And when you would go out, there would be signs on the road saying the Pendle Witch Trail, and all the sort of gift shops in town had these little tiny witches dangling from the windows. And it wasn't the history that fascinated me, it was the magic, those little witches, those little witch figures people would have dangling from their cars and from their car mirrors. And I loved the witch lore. And in fact, my grandmother is she died a while ago, and her house is no longer hers. It belongs to somebody else. But I went back to visit with my daughter and my parents probably about 6 years ago, and we went to her house. I wanted to see it again, and the very nice gentleman that lives there gave us a tour and a history, and he had done a lot of research, and he came to find out in his research that one of the women who was accused of witchcraft actually lived in that house. So when he told me that, I got chills, and I thought, no wonder I grew up to write stories about witches, because this house is so full of that sort of magical energy. So that place was really really central to those books. And in fact, Potts Bottom, the little village that the story takes place in, is not a real place, but it is very much rooted in those little Lancashire, Yorkshire villages that we would go to shop and things. And the little cobblestone streets and the row houses all sort of were there in the back of my mind. And when I was writing Poppy, that's what I was seeing. And in fact, the canal is a major part of Poppy. She runs away to it. There's an old shack there that she lives in. And I didn't realize this till I had actually written Poppy, but there is a canal near my grandmother's house, and we would go for walks along it as children. And again, this canal has a huge place in my memory bank. I can see it so clearly. And there were never any boats or barges floating down it. It was a very sort of, in those days, quite run down canal, but there would always be birds or swans floating down it. And that is the description that I drew from when I was writing Poppy. And my mum found a photograph of us walking beside the canal when I was probably about 3. And it was exactly the image in my head, and I hadn't realized there was a photograph of it. So those visual images of those moments in childhood really stayed with me, and consciously and subconsciously I drew on those, and the Poppy is full of them. It's full of my childhood. I was Cat Campbell mixing up spells in the kitchen. I don't know if you've read the second book, but it starts out with Cat mixing up potions, and those scenes were taken from me in my kitchen mixing up potions. And in fact, there's not the Poppy books, but there is a book that I also wrote middle grade called Lucy Castor Finds Her Sparkle. And that book opens with a scene, Lucy opening her cupboard to get dressed in the morning. And this scene is almost autobiographical, because I'll tell you what happened to me, but this is what happens in the book. And this is one of those moments, I think, that people always say, gosh, where did your belief and your interest in magic come from? This is one of those moments. So I was probably about a little younger than Lucy, my main character in the book. I was probably about 6, and I was getting dressed for school. And we lived in an old Victorian in London, and my room was right at the top of the house. It was probably the maid's room back in the day. It was a tiny little room, and there was one cupboard, and I opened the cupboard to get dressed for school, and standing there with a long white beard and shoes that sort of went round and round, curled up at the end, was this tiny little gnome. And now you're looking at me thinking, like, is she crazy? Before I go on, let me preface by saying I've never seen another magical creature as long as I've been alive. I hope to, but he was there, he was vivid, he was real. I wasn't imagining him. He was 3D. I can still see the sparkles on his shoes. And he didn't look very happy. He had his arms crossed and he was sort of frowning at me. And I should have spoken to him and asked him what he was doing there. I didn't. I shut the door. I ran downstairs and I ran into my parents' room, and they were getting dressed. And it was a school morning, and my mum was sort of 3 young kids, busy, flustered, probably getting the laundry together. And I said, Mum, Dad, there's a gnome in my cupboard. And my mum probably said something like, go and get dressed, stop being silly. And my dad, who is a doctor, a neuropsychiatrist, and has a great interest in not just science, but also you can't explain everything away by science. He thought this was great. And he said, really? Let's go see if he's still there. So he took my hand and we went back up to my room and opened the cupboard, and the gnome was gone. And there are two explanations. I didn't make him up, so I imagined him, which is very possible. I had, like my main character, Lucy, an extremely vivid imagination. I still do. Look at the books I write, and that makes sense. So I imagined him, or he was real. And for the longest time, I knew he was real. And so every time I'd go into my room, I'd go in really quietly and then like open my cupboard to see if he was there. He never was. And even now, when I go back home and I go into my room, I have to have a check, see if that little gnome is still there. So it's probably more likely than not I somehow hallucinated him, but we weren't reading books about gnomes. I never had a big interest in gnomes, and yet there he was. So when you're a child and you see a gnome in your cupboard, you believe in magic with your whole heart. So I was one of those children that went on believing magic, I think, way past the age I probably should. And I was okay with that. So my kids consequently have grown up in a very magical household too. But it was such an important part of my childhood. And I just loved the fact that it could take you away from whatever else was going on in your life that didn't feel so great. And I was lucky. I had a wonderful childhood, wonderful parents. But I was shy, was quirky, and I would definitely retreat into my magical world. It was my place. And there was nothing better than immersing myself sort of in a fantasy in my head, telling one of my own stories, which I like to do, or rereading one of my books, my favorite books, over and over again. So yes,
Well,
very, very magical place. And my grandmother was an amazing woman. She wasn't a big storyteller, but her house was full of nooks and crannies. And there was this big old book that was, I think, probably written in Latin. And it was sort of giant sized. And my sister and I used to go through it and think this was a spell book. We would go through it and try and decode all these spells. So it was just a really magical place. And they both have very different feels. Like Scotland is this wild sort of landscape with just these heather covered moors, and the folklore in Scotland it runs so deep, and there are all these wonderful myths and fairy stories, and I would love hearing about this. And in fact, I'm working on a couple of stories that are sort of rooted in these Scottish myths, and I am fascinated by the Highlands, and by the fact that on some of these sort of small outposts, even today, people still believe and respect the fairy world. And I just think that's fascinating. Like, you see these mounds that they say are fairy hills, and people can put their ears to them and listen. And in fact, I have a couple of Scottish stories. One of the first things I wrote before Poppy that didn't get published was a story set in the Highlands about a little house brownie. So both of those places feature strongly, actually, in most of my stories. They're either Scotland or they're Yorkshire. Lucy was Western Massachusetts, where I live now. But
and that's why I wanted to ask you, because I can see that a lot of your writing, a lot of your literature has to do with the geography and the landscape and the I guess memories of your childhood in England and in Scotland. But at some point in your life, you moved to America with your husband. Now you live in Massachusetts, in the city of Deerfield in Massachusetts, with your family, with the kids and your husband. And I wonder, what was that experience like, moving from England and the place that you knew, the landscape that you were accustomed to a world that is similar, but definitely not the same. What was that experience like?
Well, it's interesting you say that. So it was great, actually. I was very young. I'd finished school, and I wanted to be out there writing stories. I always knew that's what I wanted to do. So let me backtrack a little bit and tell you the moment when it sort of fell into place for me, and I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. I'd always loved to write stories, and I'd written a story for Just 17, which is a British magazine. I think you have the equivalent over here, 17. And I'd sent it off, and they'd accepted it. And they paid me a lot of money for it. Well, a lot of money to me back then. And I thought, of course, this is what I want to do. This is really easy. This is brilliant. I love writing stories. I should add, didn't get another story published till Poppy many years later. But at the time, that was the moment where I felt like this is what I want to do. And my dad had taken me to see, just for fun, this palm reader. Now, when I tell people this, they think, oh, beaded curtains and crystal balls and scarves everywhere. And
Darkness.
yes, it wasn't like that at all. Bashir was his name. And my dad had gone to him when he was young and asked if he should be a doctor or a fireman. And Bashir told him that his path was medicine. And so, knowing that I liked magical, strange things, my dad said, and I was about 17, did I want to see Bashir? And I thought, of course I do. Palm reader, if you've read The Marvelous Magic of Miss Mabel, there's a palm reader in there. And that was rooted in my experience with Bashir. So Bashir had an office in London, and he wore a suit and a tie, and he was about as far from a palm reader as you could imagine. In fact, his office was really quite clinical, like plain walls. There was nothing about it that said this man is a palm reader. And he took a sort of black and white ink of my palm, and then he read it. And to this day, it's still sometimes when I think about it, it gives me chills. I will never go back to another palm reader because he was far too accurate. He told me that I would, which again, you can say, oh, lots of palm readers say you'll move abroad, you'll live abroad, you'll marry someone older, and all those things are accurate. My husband's 10 years older than I. But he also looked at my hand and he said, you'll be a writer. And I said, great, I love writing stories. And then I said the question that I think all 17-year-olds probably want to know. I said, will I be famous? And he said, you will be well known in your field. I can still hear those words, and which makes me laugh now because I live in Deerfield and I do my shopping in Greenfield and I do loads of school visits locally. So probably I'm quite well known in my field. If that's as far as it goes, Bashir was still accurate. But I always had this for some reason, this pull towards America. And I think maybe growing up in London in the 80s, it was not a great time for kids coming out of school and university. It was the Thatcher years. London felt quite depressed. There were no jobs. It wasn't this hopeful, amazing city that it is now. I mean, there's lots of things about London I love, but back then I just remember going up to Scotland and Yorkshire, I'd have this wonderful uplifting feeling, and coming back down, it was gritty, it was dirty, there was like rubbish everywhere. And we lived in South London, which back then was quite a gritty sort of community. It's now everywhere in London, but Herne Hill in particular is a very gentrified, yuppified, really nice place. But back then it was a little bit gritty, and I couldn't wait to get out of there and see some of the world. So I had finished high school, and I'd done a year at college, Central Polytechnic, studying journalism because I didn't really know what else to do, and there weren't really creative writing courses back then. or if there were, no one had told me about them. I think there was one at East Anglia, which was an amazing program, but I don't think I knew about it. So I thought, well, okay, I could see myself being a journalist, but I sort of liked the idea of being roving reporter on the street with a microphone. I wasn't really interested in the sitting down and the telling, the reporting part of it. And I realized quite quickly I would make a terrible journalist because I couldn't stick to the facts. I I embellished the truth. We'd go out and we'd have to write these stories, and mine would always come back, and the teacher would go, "This was a great story, Natasha, but how much of this is true?" So I knew that wasn't my path. And to be honest with you, I wasn't that interested in it. I didn't want to be in a classroom. I was at that point trying my hand at writing, believe it or not. We call them Mills and Boon romances. I think over here they might be silhouette romances. They're those like very formulaic 10 chapters romance books.
Mm-hmm.
And I was terrible at it, but I thought that's what my that was fun. I could do it. And in fact, thinking back on it now, I got some nice responses from them. They said, this is lovely, but not quite good enough. Try us again. And I expected all writing at that point to be easy. You wrote it like my short story, you sent it off and someone accepted it. And it clearly wasn't going to be quite that easy. So not really wanting to settle down and sort of train in my craft, I jumped on a plane and came to America. And I did it for the summer. So I was in between. I'd done a year at college, and I decided I would go over there, and I was waitressing, working in a flower shop, having a great time. And I met my husband in the flower shop, and I was young, and when you're young you don't always think through your decisions. But at the end of the summer, my mum called me and said, "You have failed one part of your end of year exams. You need to come back and retake them if you want to move on to the second year." And I thought about it for a hot second and said, yes, no, thanks. I'm quite happy over here. I'm not coming back. I've met someone, he's 10 years older, so I think I'm going to stay. Now, to my parents' credit, they were amazing. I sometimes think about if any of my kids said that to me, I would not be as I would be accepting, but they seem to handle it so well and so smoothly. And the only thing my dad ever said to me was, we've always sort of trusted you to trust your instincts. And if it feels right, and this feels like your path, go for it. So I did. And they came out for my 21st birthday. And I think to check out this man who was 10 years older. And I should say I'm still married to the same man. So it was the right decision. And I think when you're young like that, you do things without really thinking them through, but it felt right. So I moved to America, and it was that easy, that simple. And I au paired, I worked in a flower shop. I was having fun basically, and I'd go home for the summers. And I had all this time, if I had an idea for a story, I'd jot it down. But there was so much I didn't know. No one had ever said to me, Natasha, you need to sit down and learn how to edit your work. No one had said to me, if you write a story and you want to get it published, you have to send it out there into the world. I'd write them because I'd have an idea and I would love it, and then I would just put them in my drawer. I didn't know what to do with them. But I did have a series of, my first sort of intro into children's writing was a friend of mine was setting up a radio station in Blue Hill Falls, Maine. And I just moved to America. I'd probably been here for about a year. And she said, listen, I know you like to write children's stories. I thought it would be really fun if we could do a series of children's stories. You would write them and I would read them out on air. And I didn't get paid for this, but I didn't care because I got to write my stories and she would read them out loud. And in fact, those stories were all about a witch. So I've always had this thing with witches. And I think part of that is because some of the stories that my mum would tell us were about a witch called Beady Eyes, and her broomstick broom who looked after her. And these stories were a big part of my childhood, the Beady Eyes stories. And we'd have those on car journeys when we would drive up to Lancashire and Scotland. Tell us a Beady Eyes story, Mum. And they were wonderful. And I couldn't remember many of the actual plots and stories themselves, but the characters were really vivid to me. So I asked my mum if she'd mind if I wrote my own Beady Eye stories, and she said, no, go ahead. So I did, and I would send them to the radio station and my friend would read them out on air. And it was fantastic because we got this audience, and we had college kids listening, and we had adults listening and kids listening. And they did a second series, and they had an underwriter. So they got to make some money, which was fantastic. And it was really fun. But I was, and I always have been, I think, quite insecure about my writing in the early days because I hadn't had any training. So I really didn't know if I was any good. And that first story I had accepted was wonderful in so many ways because it gave me the sort of the confidence to believe I could do it. But in other ways, it wasn't great because I had not learned the importance of revision. I hadn't learned the struggle that really comes with trying to become a writer and get your work out there and take yourself seriously. And I don't think I took myself seriously for a long time. And I think because Bashir had told me I was going to be well known in my field, I never really worried about it. I just felt it would happen. And it was only when my kids were, I have 4 children, and in between sort of having babies and one thing and another, what I did was run our house as a bed and breakfast, which was great because I got out all my passion for baking and cooking. But my daughter was in nursery school. She's my youngest. And I just remember one morning deciding that if I was actually ever going to try and get my stories out there and make it as a writer, I had to sit down and really write and take it seriously. And for a number of years when my kids were little, I didn't do that much writing. I think sometimes having kids can be great inspiration for writing your own stories, telling them stories. But when you have 4 children, by the end of the day, for me, I was just too tired to sort of feel creative. I just wanted a glass of wine and sit down and have some peace and quiet. So it was only later when my kids were a bit older that I decided if I was going to do this, I had to take myself seriously. And there was one evening and I went out and it was a full moon and I'm standing out there and it was very beautiful. And I remember thinking, why aren't I doing this? Like, what is it I'm scared of? And I was, well, I'm scared of the rejection. I don't want to put myself out there. What if everyone hates my stories? And then I had this little voice that said, well, that's not the worst case. The worst case is being old on sitting out here on this porch and having regret that you didn't try it. And I decided there and then that whatever happened, I would end up with a drawer full of stories for grandchildren, whether they got published or not. And that I had to basically kind of come out of my writing cupboard and start taking myself seriously and putting my work out there. And that's when I decided that I would look for an agent, and I started sending out my stories.
I can see also, Natasha, where some of the elements that were combined to make up the character of Poppy Pendle come from. I can see your interest in witches, and then of course also your personal interest in baking. But I wonder, how did you come up with the idea to write a story about Poppy Pendle, this witch who is a really good witch, but who doesn't want to be a witch and much prefers to be a French baker?
So that was one of those moments that has such a great answer to it, because I think sometimes with stories, you're never really sure where the idea comes from, or it sort of morphs over time. This was one of those what I call aha moments. So my husband likes to go to auctions and find odd things and bring them back, and he had come back from an auction with a stone goose. And I think my daughter Juliet was probably about 4 at the time, 5. She hadn't started kindergarten. And so my husband brought this goose into the garden and he put it down and it looked really real and had this little beady eye. And my daughter said, gosh, Mum, that goose looks real. And it was this beautiful stone goose. And because I'm the kind of mum that likes to tell stories, I said, yes, maybe it is real. Maybe a witch had put a spell on it and turned it to stone. At which point my daughter burst into tears and ran in the house because she was terrified this mean old evil witch was going to come and take back her goose. And so I felt terrible because I'd made my daughter cry. So I went in after her and I said, no. It wasn't an evil witch at all. It was a little girl. And she was just really, really sad. And she was so sad. She was kind of angry and she went around turning things to stone. And my daughter said, well, why was she sad and angry? And I said, well, she didn't want to be a witch. And she looked at me and she said, well, what did she want to be, Mum? And that's when I had my aha moment. I said, she wanted to be a baker. And I remember standing outside by this goose, which is still right out there, thinking, oh my goodness, like that's the story I have to write. This little girl who doesn't want to be a witch, she wants to be a baker. And it was at a time when my boys were doing Saturday morning soccer and sports teams. And I was witnessing firsthand some very intense parents who were way too invested in their kids' sports teams. And there was one moment where we turned up at some field and it was a team. It wasn't my son's team, it was a different team, but there was a boy there who was in tears because he didn't want to play. And his dad was yelling at him saying, you will play, son. I played, you're going to play. And I remember thinking, this is so out of hand, ridiculous. Like parents are so invested in their children's world to a point that isn't healthy. And I started to sort of just observe and I would see this and I would think, like, whose life is it? And so that there was so much of that going on. It was such a good time for me to write Poppy because I was sort of immersed in children of that age. And I knew that I wanted it to be, if there was a lesson in there, I wanted it to be for the parents, which is listen to your kids. And I think because I had parents who always listened to me and supported me, even when it was something that was shocking, like dropping out of college and coming to America and moving in with a man who was older, marrying him very shortly thereafter. They listened to me. And if they thought it was a crazy thing to do, they would tell me. So it wasn't like they weren't incredibly caring parents, but they let me go out there and live my life without it becoming their life. And I think that sometimes, now I'm a parent, I know it's hard to do sometimes because you do want to step in and say, oh no, I think if you do it like this, that would be better. And Poppy's parents are a good example of that. They think they know what is best for their daughter and they don't listen to Poppy. And I knew that I wanted her to be a baker just because it's such a passion of mine. Like I love writing food descriptions, and in all my books there are these descriptions of food because they're so fun to write about. And in fact, when my wonderful agent gave Poppy to my editor, she didn't want to submit it with recipes in the book. She said, because I had suggested it, she said that's up to the editor to decide. And I have a wonderful editor at Simon Schuster, Paula Weissman, and the first thing Paula said when she read Poppy was, yes, I want to publish this. Can Natasha make some recipes to include? And that was the best time, but it was also the most stressful time because I wanted them to be original. I wanted them to be my recipes. So I spent, I think, more time and energy and stress coming up with those recipes than I did writing the book, because I like the caramel crunch cookies had to be in there because that's the cookie that Poppy invents when she runs away to the bakery. And I had to come up with that recipe sort of from scratch. Some of them, like lemon bars and brownies, there are lots of those recipes out there. So I just tried lots of different recipes, and then I took components of each and made my own, and then fiddled with it. And it was a process, but I had somewhere to begin. With the caramel crunch cookies, I couldn't find anything that was remotely caramel crunch cookie-ish. So I had to sort of come up with my own prototype. And that was great, but so stressful. Like, I would meet my kids at the bus stop with about 6 containers of caramel crunch cookies, and the same with lemon bars, and they would see me coming to the bus stop and they'd run the other way. Like, they tried so many caramel crunch cookies, it took them about 2 years before they'd eat another one. And I would call my mum in tears, like, I just can't get the recipe right. And finally the book went to print, and I had to come up with the final recipe, and I really like it. Like, I'm happy with it, but it was stressful. I'll never write a cookbook, I'll tell you that. It was
You know what you mentioned about Poppy's parents is interesting, because it is clear that they live vicariously through their daughter. Just don't listen to her. They don't care what she thinks or what she wants to do or what her wishes are. But I find that there is this theme, this thread going through these 4 books that you've written about characters having to deal with the expectations of others, and how to face that sort of situation. Is this just something that I see in there, or is this something that you consciously wanted to write about in this series of books?
No, I each book, I mean, first of all, I should say I didn't set out to write a series. So I call it a collection, because they are all standalones. You don't need to read them in any particular order. So it wasn't structured as a series. Poppy was written as a standalone, very much a standalone. And in fact, I have, if you Google out there, there's some sort of YouTube clips of me saying very firmly, nope, there's not going to be any other books. This is not a series. And then it was a very organic process. And then as each book evolved, there was definitely a theme that I was writing about. And those sorts of things were for me as much as for my readers. So I think to me, they feel really real, because I was grappling with a lot of those issues. When I was writing Poppy, I really was taking my passion seriously and following it and deciding this is what I was going to do. And in that paralleled Poppy's desire. Cat is all about facing your fears. And when I was writing The Courage of Cat Campbell, I was having to face one of my biggest fears, which was going out there and speaking publicly about my work, taking myself seriously. And it's true, I've never felt particularly confident about my writing. And I think partly that's because up until I got my amazing agent, who now I can say, yes, I've been through the anti-bias graduate school. I hadn't had any formal training. I mean, it was my agent that taught me all about editing and how to do this. So I felt I had major imposter syndrome. Like, I kept waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say, no, you're not a proper author. I thought there was this way of doing things the right way, and then my Natasha way. And what I've come to realize is there is no one right way to write a book. Every author has their own method that works for them. And in fact, every book I write is different. I approach every book in a very different way. So there is no right or wrong way, but I was feeling like, how am I going to go out and talk about this when I'm not an expert? I just like to write stories. So I had to really face my own fears and start to take myself seriously. And I loved sort of using Cat as a vehicle for that. Like, she was facing all these fears, and she was a very average witch, and I actually love that about her, because she's not gifted like Poppy, and most people aren't born with this gift. They have to really work at their passion. or whatever it is they're doing to get good at it. And I felt like that was me, like I was having to really put myself out there. I'd been that person that had managed to finesse like 48 years of my life without having to stand up and speak in public. And here I was saying yes to everything that came along. That was my way of facing those fears. Yes, I will speak to the Women's Guild in South Deerfield. Yes, I will do this. Yes. And so it was a very empowering time for me, because I got to realize that things that had seemed impossible and really scary for me were actually very possible. So I was overcoming my own fears. And with each of the books, there is this sense of Mabel pushing boundaries. I think at that point, I was writing Lucy, which is not a fantasy, it's fiction. And there's this thread of fantasy, but it's not a fantasy story. And for me, that was sort of doing something that was slightly outside my comfort zone, because I'm very comfortable writing about witches and magic, and writing a realistic fiction was something I hadn't done. So I was sort of testing myself there, and I'm not good with change. So everything I write about is ultimately sort of a lesson, I think, for me as much as my readers. And I think for a story to feel authentic, you just have to sort of dig in there and find things that matter to write about. So I love the fact that they're fantasies and they're lightweight and they're fun, but I think there's also some issues there that a lot of kids have to deal with. And I love the fact that you can weave those into a fantasy, whether it's a story about witches and magic. It doesn't matter. Like kids still feel insecure. Kids still feel like they're not good enough. Kids are still scared of things. Kids don't like change. Kids don't want to be different and stand out. And all those things are in my books. So it's just been wonderful for me. And I love the fact that I can kind of work through some of my own stuff in my work.
I've always thought, that good children's literature is the kind of children's literature that can be enjoyed by both children and adults alike, where the children will read it, for the story or for certain things that appeal to them, but then the adults can read those stories and find something else besides just the story. And I feel like, that's the reason why writers like Roald Dahl, for example, are so have stood the test of time in that way. And I do see a lot of that in your books. And you're right that this is not a series of books, like you say, they're standalones. You can read Poppy first or Cat first or Mabel first. It doesn't matter. But you have created, however, I believe, an entire universe of characters, and also across time periods. I take it that was not what you were setting out to do, but I can see that that's what's happened.
And it was so fun. It was so fun. I can't tell you how much fun this is, Anton, sitting there and creating this world. And then with each book thinking, like with Cat, I went forward. So I got to imagine what it must be like for Poppy as a mother. And I loved the thought, oh, let's give her the one thing she never wants anything to do with ever again. Let's give her a daughter that wants to do magic. And so I love the way all those things that Poppy has said as a child, like, well, I'm probably never going to be like my mother. And here she is having to face these issues, and we get to see her as a grown up. And that was such fun. I loved it. And then going all the mentions of Granny Mabel in the first two books. It was in fact my nephew who was visiting for Easter, who had said to me one day, just out of the blue, I think you should write Granny Mabel's story. And I remember again thinking like, oh, that's a great idea.
That's another aha moment.
Right? Another aha moment, because you think of her as this amazing witch. And I thought, but I bet how could she be quite so well respected, quite so good, and yet be this incredible inventor at a time, Victorian times, when girls weren't allowed to do math and science. And I thought, I bet it was that way for witches. I bet they just had to practice sort of glamorizing spells and looking elegant and flying side saddle. And I just loved the idea of writing about this really ballsy witch that pushed boundaries and, you know, ridiculous flying on your broomstick side saddle. Let's dig in here and see what it was like. And then to imagine what the canal would have been like back in Victorian times. It would have been I mean, that was the heyday of canals, when they were bringing Yorkshire stone down in the barges to London, and it was a bustling place. And in Poppy and Cat's time, of course, it was just sort of this deserted waterway. And just bringing the canal back to life in my mind and my stories, that was so much fun. And then the shack that Poppy runs away to, I often have kids writing to me and they'll say things like, is that the shack that Poppy runs away to? And it's like, yes. And I wanted to go back and imagine what that was like. And I'm going to make that Ruby's house. So it was so fun weaving together the stories, and yet what I had done couldn't be undone. So it wasn't, there was no big planning involved. So I couldn't sort of, what I had written had to stay that way. And I had to kind of weave and work around that. And it was a really fun process. And in fact, when I was coming up with Della, again, it was a different friend of mine who said one day out of the blue, I think you should write the story of Witch Dupree. And it took me a minute to realize who Witch Dupree was, because there's only one mention of her. And I had to, at the back of Campbell, when Cat is studying for her exams, Clarabelle, one of the teachers, says this little rhyme to her: 1223, 1223, Rothersfield was founded by Witch Dupree. And I thought, oh, yes. Why was there a need for a witch school? What was it like back then? Because in my world, witches are these revered national treasures. They're amazing creatures. And I thought, I bet it wasn't like that back then, harking back to the Pendle Witches and the way all these things tie together. And so I started sort of researching medieval times in Lancashire. And again, I was going to base that story completely in medieval Potts Bottom, but it was my editor who said, is there a way you can kind of come at it from a contemporary angle? And first I thought, well, I don't know if I can do that. And then I just had this sort of aha moment where I thought, yes, I love this. What if she goes back in time? And the twist there with Della Dupree being Della Dupree, I loved that. It took me a long time to kind of cement the time travel piece in place, because my brain is sort of, I had a hard time grappling with the notion of time travel and how it worked. So I had a very good friend and my sister who's very good at these things, and my dad sort of sit down and try and explain to me the logistics of time travel. And that was again, the message in Della is speak up for what you believe in. And I think that message came at a very timely moment too, actually, because I'd written it before, before our lockdown year, and especially before all the Black Lives Matter stuff began to sort of just bubble up, where people were finding their voices and speaking up. But speaking up is something that I've never been brilliant at. I liked the idea. I think I remember as a child sort of watching someone get teased and feeling bad for them, but not feeling confident enough to speak up to the bully, because I knew that she'd turn around and tease me. And that's just I feel like a very empowering, important message to give to kids, which is that your voice matters. So when I was writing that, I was really writing it also for me, which is you have to speak up, you have to say what needs to be said, and it does matter, it's important. So again, another message that
I do imagine though that in not having to write a series, you probably feel less fettered by the fact that you're not writing always about the same character, always about the same place, or at least from the same perspective. But one thing that I do see in the books, the kind of one thing that brings all these characters together is the fact that they all attend or are related to this Rutherfield Academy, this school, this institution. And I wonder, reading the books and reading them to my daughter Libby, how much of your own schooling or of the British school system has shaped the creation of this Rutherfield Academy?
I think I went to a regular elementary school, local elementary school. My high school was all boys, and I was the second year of girls, actually. And it just wasn't the best experience. I mean, what came out of that was meeting my best friend. And that really, when I look back on those years, that was the best thing that came out of it. The teachers were mainly older men who were used to teaching boys and didn't really know how to teach girls. And there were so few of us, they called the boys by their surnames and the girls by their first names. And it was uncomfortable. So I think Rutherfield Academy is much more sort of grounded in the boarding school stories that I like to read about when I was younger, definitely. And in fact, one of my favorite series, shock horror, was Mallory Towers by Enid Blyton, who's not the greatest writer in the world, but I loved those boarding school stories. And I loved them because I didn't go to boarding school. And in fact, I would have hated going to boarding school. And Rutherfield Academy isn't a boarding school, but that school setting was what I loved. Sort of all the girls together and their adventures and the sort of the outings they went on and the pranks they played on each other. And I just loved the school setting. So really Rutherfield was just a fun way to do it, because I thought, well, I loved reading about boarding schools and schools in general and what goes on there. And so I'm definitely going to base my witch book around Rutherfield Academy, a witch school. So it was just really fun to, I think you write about the things that you were interested in reading about when you were younger. And I write the books that I would have wanted to read. So I've just always loved school stories.
Mm-hmm. And it is true that Great Britain is a part of the world where there is this longer and deeper tradition of these boarding schools that you're talking about, at least much more so than here in the United States or in other parts of Europe. So it does make sense that element is there, and it kind of that kind of drew my attention, and that's why I was asking you about that. Another thing that I was thinking as I was reading these books is there are a lot of books these days about witches and about wizards, and I wonder, in your opinion as an author of these books, and I want to make it very clear for the audience out there that this is not just another series of books about witches and wizards and that kind of thing. There's a lot more to it than just that. That's just one element in the story. I think there's a lot more to it than just that. But why do you think that there are so many young adult novels about witches and wizards, about magic? Why have they become so prominent? How could you explain that from the point of view of an author or somebody that has written books that include these elements?
I mean, I don't know if there's a right or a wrong answer to that, or one answer. But for me, I think it's because life sometimes can be challenging enough, and it can be hard. And I think there's something, that sense of escapism, that sense of things happening that we can't explain that might be possible. Reading about that is just, it's wonderful. It makes you believe that if this can happen to someone, maybe it could happen to me. I mean, I don't care if you're an adult or if you're a kid. I think there's something wonderful about reading a story that has magic in it, because it's escapism, isn't it? It's escaping from sort of gritty reality, really, into a world where there's the possibility of flying on broomsticks, the possibility of magic, the possibility of spells. I mean, who doesn't love that? I don't care what age you are. And I think that that is why they're so successful across the board, because there are definitely adult books now that have witches and witch lore as their main characters. And I think it's this, it's escaping. I think it's that sense of possibility, and doors opening and leaving our own lives and our own problems behind and entering this magical world. And it's wonderful. It's fun to write about. It's fun to read about. And I think it just takes people out of their own realities for a while. And that's fun. And
I just find it interesting because it is true that books about, you know, witches and wizards and all and magic could kind of function as a kind of escape from reality or escapism and going into a different world. But they can also be used, and I think you do this a little bit in these books, to kind of reflect upon our everyday reality. I feel like sometimes we tend to think that fiction is something apart from reality, but in reality, fiction is a part of reality. It springs from it. And so I feel like reading about Poppy, we could, in a way, be taking to another world, the world of Rutherford Academy and of the witch and the spells and the spell books and all of that. But at the same time, we are dealing in this book with certain topics and, you know, certain elements that have a lot to do with our everyday lives.
And I think I think that's how kids, because I write kids books, can hopefully work through some of their own problems because they can, in a fun way, so they can see that it's a fantasy, and yet Poppy's dealing with some heavy issues. I mean, her parents are awful, and really by the end of the book, Poppy's pretty depressed. I mean, she's really depressed, actually. And one of the questions I ask kids when I do school visits is, who do you think the hero of that book is? And most of the time, a lot of them will say Poppy, but some of the time, someone will say Charlie. And I say, I think you're right, because Charlie saves Poppy. Charlie goes out of her way to find a solution to save her friend. And I love that. And Poppy is the main character, but I think Charlie is the true hero of that story, the quiet unsung hero that figures out how to bring Poppy back from the dark side. And there's a lot of darkness in Poppy. And I think hopefully I handle it in a light-hearted way, but there are moments when she's in a dark place and her parents are. I think that's what Roald, I mean, and Roald Dahl, I just think the way he can do that sometimes is just, for me, he's always, I just find him very inspiring as a writer, taking something that is quite dark and presenting it in a fun way. Mm-hmm. And it's you sit back and you suddenly think, oh God, Poppy's parents have put bars on her windows. They've taken away the oven. They've locked the door. That's bad. And yet I always, as I say to kids, I am a big believer in the power of a happy ending. So I feel like, you know, when you read a Natasha book that there's going to be a happy ending there, because I think we all want a happy ending, don't we? And there's enough not happy endings out there in real life. I don't want them in my books. But I think it's I've had so many letters from kids who have been able to identify with these characters. And on one of my school visits, a teacher had said to me, sort of, I'm interested why you think kids can identify with characters that are sort of magical when there's nothing that they have in common with, but it doesn't matter if you're a witch or you're a fairy or if you're an elf, you still feel the same feelings that kids feel. And I think it's the emotion, the connection to the fact that, like I said, you feel different, you feel scared. All those emotions, however you set them, is what kids identify with. So they're not identifying with Poppy as a witch, they're identifying with Poppy as someone whose parents don't listen to her. and the fact that she's a baker. And kids, I'm finding there are a lot of bakers out there, because I wasn't sure how many kids would actually make my recipes, but apparently quite a lot.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. And I've already gotten requests from my own daughter to actually try some of those recipes, because she's sure that Poppy would like them. And so that's the kind of thing about a character like Poppy, that it's a character that, in a way, I feel like she's trying to make herself compatible with the reality out there, and trying to find her place within that reality. And so that's how I really read the title of The Power of Poppy Pendle. It's the power of magic, of course, but also the power to find a place within reality, within society, within just her everyday life. And that power can extend also to other characters, to other people around her. The power of her parents to maybe understand that they're not doing it right. The power of the friendship that she has with Charlie, which is important in the development of the story. So, I mean, I feel like all of that is there, and that's why I'm thinking that the book is about magic, is about witches, is about spells and spell books and all that kind of thing. But there's a lot more to it than just that.
Yes. Yes.
I wonder if it's difficult as an author to try to write a book about a wizard or a witch and kind of escape the shadow of Harry Potter and other books that have been so popular, have been made into movies, and are part of pop culture.
When I wrote Poppy, I think the first Harry Potter had come out, maybe the first few, but I haven't read all the Harry Potters, actually. I read the first 4 to my boys, and then they took over and finished reading them. And for me, actually, they got too dark. But I do remember reading the first Harry Potter and absolutely loving it. And she was a great, I mean, she's an incredible author, and she's done more for reading, I think, than any author out there. I mean, she made reading sort of popular and fun in a way that no other author's been able to do, for adults as well as kids. I mean, everyone on the subway had a copy of Harry Potter, and I remember the midnight parties that my husband would take my boys to. So she was definitely a big influence on my writing. But I knew so strongly, I would say sort of J.K. Rowling and Roald Dahl mashed together was sort of the inspiration for Poppy. And yet it definitely came from in here. Now, reading it through, I had a very good friend who was an amazing sort of critic, and sometimes would pick up something, actually, and in Poppy. I think I had, when in the scene when she as a baby goes to Rothersfield Academy, and I think it's marshmallow balls are bouncing about all over the place. In one of the early drafts of that, they were actually chocolate frogs, and that wasn't intentional, but my friend had said there are chocolate frogs in Harry Potter, so should probably take that out. I really didn't want anybody to say, "Ooh, this is a Harry Potter spin-off." And it was so different from Harry Potter in every.
Oh, I do believe that that's what I wanted. That's why I mentioned Harry Potter, because to me, one could look at this book and approach this book and think, well, this is just another story about a witch. But what I want to make clear is that to me, the pleasant surprise about Poppy and the other books is the fact that they're not just another, as you say, spin-off of a story about a witch, that there's a lot more depth, a lot more interest than just that. One can read this book, for example, for the story, but there's a lot more in there than just the story of a witch.
I think, and that a lot of that comes from my love of witches, so it's sort of rooted in me. So it really was my story. It wasn't like, oh, witches are popular, let's write a witch story. Witch schools are popular, let's set it in a witch school. It was a Natasha book coming from this place of magic in my childhood, just being making such an impression on me, and immersing myself in it to a point where those years were profound years for me. Like, I can still remember what it feels like to be 10 inside. And I that's why you don't need to have kids of your own to write stories for children. Absolutely not. You just need to be able to remember what it felt like to be a child. Because whether you're a child now, or whether you were a child, 40 years ago, times change, games change, society is shifting in different directions, but those feelings and emotions, they're the same. They don't change. Kids are grappling with the same kinds of things and emotions that we all felt when we were young. Those feelings are real and powerful. And I can still remember how it felt to have friends one day and no friends the next day, because everyone had sort of decided they didn't want to be your friend, or how sometimes you'd feel really embarrassed in a certain situation or really unsure of yourself. And I wasn't a particularly confident kid in a lot of ways. So even though perhaps that didn't always come across to other people, that's how I felt inside. So all those things were channeled into my story. So I think it was, for me, genuinely, I think I have a big interest in witches. And going back to your question, why are witch books so popular? I think I'm not alone in that. Lots of people find witches fascinating, and I still do. I'm not going to say I'm not going to write I'm finishing up a story I'm working on now, and it's very different. It has cats in this one, but it also does have witches in, but it's sort of very different from the Poppy books. So that magical world is something I know I'll probably go on exploring in different ways, from different angles, because I'm just fascinated by it. Still love the possibility of magic, opening my cupboard and seeing a gnome. You just never know.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to show to the camera the books. We have The Power of Poppy Pendle, which is the first one that I read to my daughter Libby. Then we have The Daring of Della Dupree right there. We also have The Marvelous Magic of Miss Mabel. And we have The Courage of Campbell. And remember, they're standalone, so you don't have to read one after the other. You can just read whichever one you want at any given point. One that I don't have here on my desk, because I haven't read it yet, is one that you've mentioned a couple of times already during our conversation, which is Lucy Castor Finds Her Sparkle. And in this book, like I said, I haven't read it yet, but it seems to have a different role for magic than the rest of the stories of Poppy Pendle and company. Can you tell us a little bit about, or tell me a little bit about this book? Because, like I said, you mentioned that there's a little magic in there, but it seems to be a little bit different.
Yes, and I started writing this one as a fantasy, and I had this idea that it was going to be set in this old house full of clocks that were magic. And in fact, the house was sort of based on the house I grew up in, because my dad is a big collector of clocks. So there were clocks everywhere, and they were always chiming at different times, and they were always telling different times.
Oh, I just love that sound.
Yes, except when you're lying asleep in bed and you go back to visit your parents' house and there are still all these clocks, and I get up in the night and I go around stopping them all because they drive me crazy. But I had this idea that the clocks would see things. I love the idea that these clock faces see what's going on, and so many of them have been around forever because they're antique clocks, and that at some point you could look into them, into the faces, and see memories of times past. And I just thought that was a great idea. And I'm not a planner. I don't plan out every single chapter and happening in my books. And again, I know there are authors that tend to plan more, and then there are authors that tend to have a starting point and sort of end point, and then figure out where you're going along the way. And that's me. I love this idea of clocks being magic. And yet, as I started to write the story, Lucy was such a strong character. And Lucy is, I'm not Lucy as a little girl, but there's a lot of me in Lucy. as a little girl. And she was such a strong character, and it just wasn't a fantasy. I felt like I was forcing it to be something that it wasn't. And I realized after about 3 or 4 chapters that this was Lucy's story. Wasn't Lucy's story set in a fantasy. It was Lucy's story, and it was about change. And Lucy is very much like I was, in that she has a very vivid imagination. She isn't ready to grow up. She comes back from summer holiday, and her best friend of since kindergarten has changed. And again, I remember this clearly when I was younger, seeing girls that I'd been good friends with suddenly grow up, like overnight it felt, and become really grown up and mature. And I wasn't ready to give up my magical world. And that is Lucy. And she's dealing with all this change going on in her world. And her mom is pregnant with twins, and she's an only child, and she doesn't approve of her mom having babies. And even though I had a brother and a sister, I remember a friend of mine whose mother was pregnant when I was probably about 8 or 9, and thinking like, oh my goodness, like I would die if my mum had another baby. I don't want any more competition. I was the middle child, and my older sister was very different in temperament, very sort of calm, and I was very intense, very dramatic, very emotional. And then my brother was sort of just off doing his thing. So I think I got a lot of the attention in the family. And I would not have wanted to share that with anyone else. So those feelings, even though Lucy is an only child, definitely a lot of them I could really relate to. And she is just dealing with her whole world shifting and changing, and she's not ready to give up the magic. So there is this thread of magic, like she sees the gnome in her cupboard, and she's always looking for signs of magic in the garden. But that's a book really about change, and how even when you feel like your life is turned upside down, and these things may seem little things to a grown up, but when you lose your best friend, when your mother is having babies, when the neighbors put up a great big wall blocking all the light from your lovely garden, you feel like your world has been turned upside down. And so this, I think, is a book that really hopefully will help kids see that even when you aren't looking for change and you don't want change and it feels like the worst thing in the world, it can actually end up being a good thing. And I think, again, that's a good message for all of us, because I've often been forced into a situation that I didn't want to do, that has ended up being the best, most amazing thing. And in fact, when I first met my husband, we were living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and now I'm living out in the country in Western Massachusetts. And he had always wanted to live out here and raise a family. And he had this beautiful house in the country that he was renting and wanted to move out there. And I looked at it and said, it's gorgeous, but I'll never live out there. I grew up in the city. I kind of don't want to live in the country, even though I like the country. And then it would make a great bed and breakfast. So set it up as a bed and breakfast. And right before we opened, the couple had a fight and left. And so we had bookings and no one to run it. So I was sort of forced into coming up running this bed and breakfast and didn't want to do it. And after a year, realized I love living in the country. It's fantastic. I can go back to city living. So I think sometimes it's good to show that even when you are forced to do things that are not your choice, change can be a really good thing. So it's a very different feel. Although people that read it still tell me, I can tell it's a Natasha book. But I feel very attached to Lucy because there's definitely bits of me in Lucy. I mean, there's lots of Lucy that isn't me, but I think if people want to sort of get a sense of my imagination as a child, they'll get that when they read Lucy. And that's a good thing and a bad thing to have, because it's wonderful when you're writing stories. But even now, like my kids will be like, Mum, you only need to call once and leave a message, I'll get it. But I tend to be that parent that will call again and again and again because I'm worried. I visualize that something has happened to my kids. And I would always be at the window waiting for my parents to come back when they went out in the evenings, because I'm sure they'd had a crash if they were home late. So very vivid imagination like Lucy. But it's it still has a Natasha vibe to it, but it's just a completely different sort of a story from the Poppy books.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned you did mention though before, Natasha, that you did not plan very much, that you were not really a planner, which kind of brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you a little bit as we're winding down the conversation about your creative process. Reading these books, one of the things that I kept wondering is how does she write these stories? Not how does she come up with the ideas, which we've talked about, but how does she write these stories? Is there a specific moment of the day or night when you write regularly? You mentioned that you were not a lot of a planner, so do you improvise? Or are there moments when it is not clear to you what the story is going to be like or where it's going to go? Tell us a little bit about the writing process that led you to writing these books, and also the Lucy Castor book.
I think when I have my idea and I sit down to write, I have a sense of what it is I'm wanting to write about, and I'm very visual in my writing. The way I describe it to kids is it's like I've got a movie playing in my head, so I can see the scenes as it's happening. It's almost like I'm there. And in fact, when I was writing Poppy in particular, I didn't always know what was going to happen. And in fact, the scene where she turns her parents to stone, I had not planned for that. And as I'm writing, I see the action and I can think through what's going to happen, but it's sort of like following a movie in my head. So it's not like I'm sitting there thinking, and now what happens next? It's much more organic than that. And I think when I'm very involved in my story, the pictures are there in my head and they just develop as the words are going onto the page. And I remember being quite taken aback when she turned her parents to stone. But I look on it.
So was I.
Yes. And I always feel like if I'm surprised when I am writing the story, then readers will be surprised when they are reading. And so for me, that works best. I remember talking to an author at an event who planned everything out. Like, their notes were staggering. They had sheets and sheets of notes for each chapter and everything that was going to happen. And I thought, that's how I should be doing it. And I tried a story that way and it was flat. It had no energy to it. And for me, the energy in a story is so important. Like that's the most important thing. And I think that if you are excited to write that story and you're really, really invested in it, it comes across on the page. So I get that because I don't know what's going to happen. So I'm not a nighttime writer. I am an early to bedder and I'm an early riser. So morning hours for me are the best. And in fact, often when I wake up, before I get up, those early hours, like 5, 6, when I'm lying there, I have really good ideas. And that's often when I think about my story and I move it forward, it's like, oh yes, this is great. This is great. Because you're not thinking too much on it because you're still quite sleepy. And so ideas tend to really come into my head at that time. Those are great thinking hours for me. So I do most of my writing in the mornings, but if I'm on a roll, I'll keep going. And now my youngest just left for college this year, so my days are more open, so I can write during the day, all day if I want. And I try not to do that too much. When I'm writing my first drafts, I write them really, really quickly. And part of that is it's almost like sort of wanting to catch those ideas before they flutter away, sort of like butterflies. And I just have to get them down onto paper. And I need to keep going and immerse myself in that so I don't lose the momentum and the pacing. And I just want to sort of get it down. And that is a wonderful time, but it's also quite exhausting and quite stressful because I can't think or focus on anything else. And once I've got that first draft down, then I spend months and months editing. Like I truly never understood what editing was when I wrote that very first story that got accepted. That was really a fluke in so many ways, because I get it, but it took working with my agent and really understanding the process, how important editing is. Like, for me, that's now the most important part of the process. So my first drafts are just quick, and they just come out. And then I will spend many hours just going back and crafting them and finding the plot holes and sort of making sure it all fits together. But I don't plan out too much in advance. I will, as I'm walking, or going about my day, I'll be thinking about my story a lot, and I move it forwards in my head often before I sit down and write, or at least a general direction. But it's much more when I'm that invested in the characters, the story just sort of unfolds as I'm writing it. I think there's a lot of faith involved, because if you sit down and you think, God, I'm committing to this project that's going to take me months, and I've no idea where I'm going or what I'm really doing, you would never sit down to start writing. So there's a lot of faith involved, like this will somehow work. And I've just almost finished a very first draft of the story I've been working on. And I've been working on that in a very different way, because it's actually world building, but a very different world from Poppy's world. So instead of writing the whole thing and then going back and editing it, with this one, I have been doing it chapter by chapter and then getting feedback and then going back to the beginning. So it's sort of like I keep starting and world building and going back and adding and getting my grounding really strong, because it's such a different approach to magic that I wanted to make sure I understood what I was writing about. So this is again a different approach for me on this book. Each book is different, and each book requires a different process of writing. And Poppy was just sort of really quick first draft, then lots and lots of editing. But some drafts are much easier to write, and some drafts are much more of a challenge. Like Mabel, I think that's one of my best books. I could not get that first draft right to save my life. I struggled and struggled and struggled. And finally, I was ready to just give up. My agent at the time said, and it was wonderful, it was what I needed to hear. She said, I think this is going to be one of your finest manuscripts, Natasha, don't give up. And that just gave me the incentive to just keep going. But I couldn't work out what I was trying to say in that book. I couldn't pin Mabel down. And I think maybe that's because I was dealing with an era, the Victorian era, and I wanted to write from Mabel's point of view as a girl then, not with my eyes as a grown up, looking at it through my lens now. I wanted to really put myself in Mabel's position, without any of the sort of, without my thoughts as a grown woman in 2020, sort of channeling through Mabel, because that's not who Mabel was. So that was a really tough book for me to get right, but I think that's one of the ones I'm proudest of. And the adoption factor was something too. Mabel, I mean, there was no adoption in Victorian times, and I had this sense of what I was trying to say about family being whoever the people who love you are. And I gave it to a friend of mine who has an adopted son. I wanted to get her feedback, and she was amazing, and she really helped me see that it's not that simple, and that the mother plays such an important role in a child's life. If they've been put up for adoption, you never forget your sort of ghost mother, if you like, that's she's always with you. And I did a lot of revising after talking with her about that. So each book is so different. I think it depends what you're writing about, and just the sort of energy that project creates, and the energy is different for each book. Like I I write differently in the winter than I do in the spring. And it's interesting because if I'm writing in the winter, often my stories will sometimes have a very wintry setting, but sometimes I'll make sure I base them in the summer because I'm tired of the winter. So everything is a factor in my writing, and little things will present themselves that sometimes only when I'm reading back on it, I'll be like, oh, that's right. That's because I was feeling that day that really figured strongly. So it's dependent on the moment, and it's dependent on the story. But I am definitely I'm definitely someone who doesn't plan out everything in advance. And I remember being at the Roald Dahl Museum, actually, in Little Missington, I think it's Little Missington, in England. And I had taken my nephew there, and they had a bank of earphones that you could put on, and each one was an author talking about their process, their writing process. And that was one of those aha moments for me. It was very illuminating, because up until then I'd really felt like, oh, you go to, you get your MFA and you get taught how to be a writer, and listening to all these different incredible authors, Philip Pullman, Jacqueline Wilson, talk about their process, I realized, like, oh, okay, they sort of do it like I do it, like, but they're all really different and different from each other, and there isn't one right approach. So I just think the writing process for me is dependent on the book I'm writing.
And when you say that, it makes me think of a text I was reading just the other day by the really famous classic Argentine writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who was saying something like that. There's not really an aesthetics, a specific aesthetics to my writing. It just depends on the book. It just depends on the moment. And I can tell you, my wife and I read to our daughter, who's 8 at this point, when we're recording this, every night after dinner. And and sometimes she reads to us and sometimes we read to her, but in any case, it's when we got to that point in the Poppy story where she turns her parents to stone, I looked at my wife and she looked at me, and we were thinking, no, this is getting even better. But you should have seen also the expression on Libby's face, on our daughter's face. She was getting into the story and getting just as surprised as we were, and as apparently you were as you were writing it yourself. So that really is a testament to the power of literature itself, and stories like this one. I do have to ask you before we finish, if there's anything you already mentioned a little bit before, that there were some stories you were working on. Is there anything that you're working on in particular that you would like to mention? Anything that you can disclose to wind down the conversation today on the written page?
I'm working, one that I finished that my agent loves as much as me, is rooted in Scotland, my love of Scotland, and it's a ghost story, and it's has a boy main character, which I've been really wanting to get out there. I mean, I have 3 boys, and I think the fact that I have 3 boys means I can write stories that hopefully appeal to boys and girls. I just don't like this idea that, oh, this is a girl's story, this is a boy's story. No, a story is a story, but I want to have a good, strong main character who's a boy, because I've done lots of girls. So this is a little boy who's orphaned, who goes to stay in the Highlands of Scotland with his great cousin, Wizard McTavish, who is loosely based on my father, actually. And Wizard McTavish is an inventor, sort of mad, scatty inventor, as well as being a wizard. And again, loosely based on my dad, who in his childhood would make radio sets and his own homemade fireworks, which, if you're watching this and you're young at home, don't try. He has his own windmill, so we make our own electricity, as does McTavish. And McTavish's windmill blows away, and his castle is full of ghosts, and they are hugely annoying to McTavish. But Jack sees them and makes friends with them, and understands how they feel, because he spent the last 2 years since his parents have died being sent around the country feeling like a recycled package, going to different relatives who look after him and send him on because they're doing their duty, but they don't see Jack or care about Jack or even like Jack. So he ends up at this castle where he makes friends with these ghosts, and Wizard McTavish does not turn out to be the kind of wizard he thinks he is. And it's just, oh, it's a ghost story. It's a ghost story with a twist, because these ghosts are not your regular ghosts, and there's a haunted house in there, and it's about finding your place. It's about belonging. And in fact, all my stories actually ultimately come down to one thing, which is, I think, believing in yourself, knowing yourself, and whichever book I'm sort of thinking about, ultimately the message is about finding out who you are. And Jack comes to find a place that he can call his home. So that's one of the ones that's sort of done and out there. And then I also have just finished up a story that I won't say too much about it, but it has cats in it, it has magic in it, but magic not as we know it. So this is why I had to do so much world building, because I had to sort of come at thinking about magic in a completely different way. When I was writing the Poppy books, even though that was my series, my characters, my story, the magic was much more mainstream magic, because we all think about magic, witches, spells, magic. This book is very different, and it's not a series, but I could see it becoming like the Poppy books, in that I might need to write about a different character or take this world and kind of expand on it in a different way with another character. And it has cats in there, and it's based in Cornwall, which is a place I feel is full of magic, and also lots of cream teas and scones, clotted cream, cakes. So it's my love of magic and baking, but sort of baked up in a very different way from the Poppy books. So that's fun. So I'm at the part where I finished my first draft, and I'm just about to sit down and go through it and start the nitty-gritty editing part, which now, like I said, is really one of my favorite parts of the whole process. And I love telling that to kids, because they all hate revising their work, and I was one of them. But I get it now. So yes, very different things coming up, but all fantasy, and I love it. I feel very blessed to be able to do what I love.
Well, we definitely look forward to those. And, before closing, because as you know, I have a class to teach in about 15 minutes or so, but I can't close this conversation without asking you two very short, brief questions that come from my daughter, Libby, who was so excited when she knew that I was going to be interviewing the author of Poppy Pendle and all the other books. And so, she had two questions that she wanted you to answer. So very briefly, here at the end, I want to give them, and I'm going to ask the question. So the first one is, Natasha, she wants to know, Libby wants to know, maybe other readers out there want to know, do you write about witches because you would have wanted to be a witch?
Yes. Maybe when I was your age, this answer is for you. I really wanted to be a witch. I wanted to fly on a broomstick. I wanted to make spells. I wanted to be magical. Absolutely.
Well, and I knew the answer would be that, but I'm glad that is the case.
A good witch, not an evil witch. And again, another thing I like about my world is that magic is ultimately a good thing. And even Madeline Reynolds, who's seen as an evil witch, I don't think comes from an evil place. And that's a conversation for another day, looking at what makes someone evil, because Poppy isn't evil. Poppy does things that aren't good always, but it comes from a place of despair and sadness, as does Madeline Reynolds. So I don't think there's such a thing as bad magic. I think it's witches getting emotional and using their powers in ways that aren't necessarily helpful. But my world is a world of good magic, and I would have been a good witch.
Just like we do sometimes, even when we don't have magic, we do have our emotions too, right?
You
And
do.
so do witches. Now, the second and last question from this one, also from Libby, is she has seen that there are all these recipes at the end of the books, and she wants to try some of those, and she would like to know, which one would be your favorite, or a couple of them that are your favorites that maybe you would advise her to try out first.
Well, I'm very fond of if you like coffee, Libby, the coffee cupcakes are delicious. And even kids who don't think they like coffee love those. I think the lemon bars are spectacular, but that might be something, a bake after you've baked one of the easier ones. Although hopefully the recipe is written in such a way that it's easy to follow. The brownies are really simple and really delicious, Libby. My boys would make those after school by themselves in one bowl, easy, quick. You don't even need a grown-up to help you with those. Those are fantastic. And the orange cake is very good. The chocolate fork cookies, which are Poppy's chocolate meltaways, are actually a recipe of my grandmother's. And when you make those, if you make those, Libby, put in about a tablespoonful less flour, because I had problems translating that recipe. That was actually my grandmother's recipe, and I really didn't want to alter it. It was ancient, and it came from one of her cookbooks, and she'd handwritten it. And again, I love the way recipes kind of connect and weave family, stories, magic all together. That's a very important one. But I think there's just a touch too much flour in the recipe as it's written. So do a spoonful less flour. But those are awfully good if you like chocolate. And if those are too chocolatey, add a little less of the cocoa powder to them, because sometimes kids think they're a bit strong. And the caramel crunch cookies I'm very proud of, because those were my own invention. So yeah, you can't go wrong. They're all good. And the chocolate butter bread is something that I had created when I was running the bed and breakfast. So that was that's a fun one to do, and it makes you feel very accomplished, because it's not that difficult. It's just time consuming, because it sits and rests and then it rises, and it's a very when you bring it out, if you bake it in one of those fancy cake pans with the design, it looks very impressive, Libby.
Well, there's more than a connection between recipes and spells, and we definitely will have to try them out and get back to you once we do them. Natasha Lowe, it really has been, I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it has been to spend this hour and, I don't know, 45 minutes chatting with you about your books, your love of baking, your love of witches, your literature, and of course, we would love to see you again sometime in the future when more books come out. We'll be attentive, and of course, you were always invited to come back to the written page here on my YouTube channel.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I've loved it. I feel like I rambled on far too much, but it was just wonderful talking with you. I loved it. Thank you so much for inviting me. Say hi to Libby for me.
I definitely will. Thank you so much for being here. This has been a new episode of the Written Page podcast, which in this case is also a videocast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and mine, and also Natasha Lowe's, is the copyright of this episode, which we recorded live in this conversation via Zoom from the state of Tennessee and the state of Massachusetts in the around the middle of October 2021. You'll be able to see it and listen to it very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. And of course, check out the books of Natasha Lowe, published by Simon Schuster. Books like The Courage of Cat Campbell, The Marvelous Magic of Miss Mabel, The Daring of Della Dupree, and The Power of Poppy Pendle. Let's not forget, of course, Lucy Castor Finds Her Sparkle. It has been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did here on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Time to keep reading good literature. And of course, if you have any comments, leave them underneath this video. I'm always looking forward to hearing from everybody out there. Thanks again, and so long, everybody.